The desert wind howled across the red canyon walls as Captain Daniel Wright examined the strange metallic object, half buried in the sand, and his 6 rangers stood in a loose circle around him with rifles at the ready while scanning the horizon for any sign of the Apache war party they had been tracking for 3 days, and Sergeant Henry Cole knelt beside the object as his weathered hands brushed away centuries of accumulated dust to reveal symbols that seemed to shimmer in the harsh Texas sunlight. And Daniel had seen many strange things in his 15 years as a ranger, but nothing like this because the object was perfectly smooth and roughly the size of a wagon wheel and made of a material that looked like silver but felt warm to the touch despite being buried in cool sand, and the symbols etched into its surface were not Spanish or Apache or anything he had ever encountered, and he admitted to Henry that he did not rightly know what it was but had a feeling they were about to find out. And Lieutenant Paul Gardner, who was the youngest of the group at 23, circled the object nervously while pointing out that the tracks led right up to this spot and then just vanished, because 40 Apache scouts do not just disappear into thin air. And Daniel muttered that everything disappears into something while remembering the words his grandfather had told him before he died, because the old man had been a ranger too, back when Texas was still fighting for independence, and he had spoken of strange lights in the desert and voices that came from nowhere. And Corporal Jack Murphy, who was a stocky Irishman, spat tobacco juice into the sand while mentioning that his mother used to tell stories about fairy mounds back in the old country, where time moved different and you step in one spot to come out somewhere else entirely. But Private Billy Hayes said this was not Ireland, though. His voice lacked conviction, because Billy was barely 19, and fresh-faced and eager, and this was his first real patrol beyond the settlements, and the remaining 2 rangers named Corporal Frank Dixon and Private George Mitchell stood watch on the canyon rim, where Frank was a former Confederate officer who had found redemption in the Rangers after the war, while George was a freed slave who had proven himself the best tracker in West Texas. And Daniel made his decision to have Henry get the surveying equipment from the horses because he wanted measurements and sketches of everything to document this proper before they touched it again. But as Henry moved to comply, the artifact began to hum with a low sound, at first that was barely audible over the wind, but it grew steadily louder, and the symbols started glowing with a pale blue light that seemed to come from within the metal itself. And Daniel commanded everyone to get back, but it was too late because the light exploded outward in a perfect sphere while engulfing all 6 rangers in its radiance, and Daniel felt a sensation like falling though his feet never left the ground. And the desert spun around him with colors bleeding together like wet paint, and then everything went black. And when he opened his eyes, the desert was gone, and they stood in a vast chamber made of the same strange metal as the artifact and illuminated by strips of cold white light that ran along the walls, and the air smelled wrong because it was sterile and empty and nothing like the dust and sage of Texas. And Jack whispered, "Holy Mother of God," while making the sign of the cross, and Paul had drawn his revolver, though his hand trembled as he asked where they were. But before Daniel could answer, a door that he had not noticed opened in the seamless wall, and through it came a figure that made every man reach for his weapon, because it was humanoid and roughly 7 feet tall, with skin that shimmered like oil on water, and its eyes were large and dark, and contained depths that suggested intelligence far beyond anything Daniel had encountered, and it wore no clothing that he could identify, though its body seemed covered in a suit that moved like liquid metal, and the being raised one hand in what might have been a peaceful gesture. And when it spoke, its mouth did not move, but words formed directly in Daniel's mind that were clear as a bell, saying, "Welcome, Rangers of Texas, because we have been waiting for you since your world was young." And Daniel Wright had faced down Comanche war parties and Mexican bandits and desperate outlaws who had nothing left to lose, but nothing had prepared him for this moment, and he kept his hand steady on his Colt revolver, though some instinct told him that bullets would be useless against whatever this being was, and he asked what the being meant by waiting for them, because they did not even know they were coming here until about 30 seconds ago, and the being moved closer, with steps making no sound on the smooth floor while Henry Cole shifted position to angle for a better shot if needed. But Daniel gave a slight shake of his head because whatever was happening here, starting a gunfight, did not seem like the best approach, and the being communicated that time moves differently for its kind because they have observed the human species for 12,000 years, and watched them grow from scattered tribes to the civilization they now build. And they have waited for the moment when humans would be ready to learn the truth, and Paul Gardner demanded to know what truth and who they were, and what this place was. And the being gestured so suddenly, the walls of the chamber became transparent, and the Rangers found themselves staring out at a vista that defied comprehension because they floated in darkness surrounded by countless points of light. And below them, curved and beautiful and impossibly large, hung the earth, and Billy Hayes made a choking sound and staggered backward while saying, "That was not possible because it was just not possible." And the being continued to explain that they are the Watchers who have seeded life across 1,000 worlds and guided civilizations through their growth and protected the young races from threats they cannot yet comprehend, because the human planet is one of many in their care. And Frank Dixon, ever practical, despite the circumstances, asked the question that Daniel was thinking about: why they revealed themselves now and why they brought the Rangers here, and the Watcher replied that it was because of what happened 3 days ago in the canyon. Because the 40 Apache scouts they were tracking did not vanish, but were taken, and George Mitchell spoke for the first time since the transport, with his deep voice steady as he asked taken by who, and the Watcher's emotions were alien. But Daniel could sense something like concern radiating from the being, as it explained they were taken by another species called the Harvesters, who do not share the Watcher's philosophy of gentle guidance, because they see young races like humans as nothing more than resources to be exploited. The wall shifted to show images that made Daniel's blood run cold, because he saw creatures that looked like a cross between insects and machines, with cities burning, and people being herded into massive ships like cattle, and the technology was beyond his understanding, but the suffering was universal. And the Watcher explained that for thousands of years they have protected the human world from the Harvesters' notice, but the human species grows rapidly now with the Industrial Revolution and expanding population and electromagnetic transmissions, making humans become visible to those who would do them harm. And Jack Murphy had finally found his voice again to ask why they did not just protect humans themselves. Because if the Watchers were so powerful, why did they need 6 Texas Rangers? And the Watcher said they cannot intervene directly because they are bound by laws older than the sun, and they can guide and teach, but cannot fight human battles, because each species must prove itself worthy of survival and must develop the strength to stand on its own. And Henry Cole lowered his rifle slightly to ask what the Watchers wanted from 6 Texas Rangers, and the being revealed that the Apache scouts were taken as a test because the Harvesters wanted to see if the Watchers would respond and if they would break their own laws to save them. But they did not, because to do so would doom the entire human species, since if the Watchers fight human battles, then humans will never develop the strength to fight battles themselves. And Daniel was beginning to understand as he said, they could give humans the tools and the knowledge to prepare them. And the Watcher confirmed this was precisely correct, because the 40 Apache warriors are being held in a harvesting facility on the human moon, and it is lightly guarded because the Harvesters do not believe the human species capable of reaching them. But they are wrong, since the Watchers can give the Rangers the means to mount a rescue, but the Rangers must be the ones to execute it. And Paul laughed with a slightly hysterical edge to it, as he pointed out they were talking about going to the moon because humans do not even have flying machines yet, let alone whatever it would take to reach space. But the Watcher said simply that humans will achieve this in less than 100 years, when the human species will walk on the lunar surface. But those 40 Apache warriors do not have 100 years, because they have at most 3 days before the Harvesters complete their experiments and dispose of them. And the chamber fell silent, except for the faint hum of whatever machinery powered this impossible place. And Daniel looked at his men to see the fear and confusion in their faces, but also saw the determination, because they were Rangers who rode into danger, because someone had to stand between civilization and chaos. And Daniel said slowly that if they do this, and if they somehow succeed in this insane rescue mission, then what happens next? And the Watcher's emotion shifted to something that might have been approval, as it explained that then they will know that humanity is ready for the truth and ready to learn that they are not alone in the universe, and that threats exist beyond their atmosphere, and that their destiny lies among the stars, because the Watchers will begin to prepare humans for the challenges ahead. And Frank Dixon asked quietly, what happens if They fail, and the Watcher replied that then the harvesters will know that humans are easy prey, and they will return in force, and the human species will be harvested before it ever reaches the stars. So the great-great-grandchildren will never exist, and human civilization will be fuel for harvester machines. And Daniel holstered his revolver and met the Watcher's alien gaze to say, "Well then, they better not fail." And he asked how they get to the moon. And the Watcher led the 6 Rangers through corridors that seemed to stretch on forever with each turn, revealing new wonders that defied their understanding of reality. And Daniel tried to memorize the route, but the passages seemed to shift and change when he was not looking directly at them. And they emerged into a chamber 10 times the size of any building Daniel had ever seen, with a craft floating in the center that took his breath away, because it was roughly cylindrical and maybe 60 feet long, with a surface that reflected light like polished obsidian and no visible seams or rivets or anything to suggest how it was built or how it worked. And the Watcher explained this is a scout vessel designed for short-range operations within a solar system, and it will take them to the lunar surface in approximately 4 hours. And Billy Hayes walked slowly around the craft with his hand hovering above the surface, but not quite touching it, as he asked how it flies, because he does not see any propellers or steam engine, or nothing. And the Watcher said it manipulates gravitational fields and the principles are complex, but the operation has been simplified for human use. So one of them will pilot while the others prepare for combat. And George Mitchell's eyes narrowed as he pointed out they have 6 rifles and 6 revolvers and whatever ammunition they are carrying. But something tells him that will not be enough against creatures that can travel between worlds. And the Watcher gestured. So a section of the wall rippled like water to reveal a rack of weapons that looked nothing like any gun Daniel had ever seen, because they were sleek and ergonomic, with grips that seemed molded for human hands, but barrels that glowed with internal light. And the Watcher explained these are directed energy weapons that humans would call beam rifles, and they fire concentrated plasma at temperatures hot enough to melt through most materials, and each weapon contains enough power for approximately 200 shots before needing to be recharged. And Jack Murphy picked one up while testing its weight, because it was lighter than his Winchester rifle, but somehow felt more solid and more deadly, and he asked if they have a practice range where the Rangers can learn how to use these weapons, but the Watcher replied that time is limited, though the weapons are designed to be intuitive, so they just aim and press the trigger mechanism, and the weapon will do the rest. Paul Gardner was examining a different section of the wall where suits hung that looked like nothing from Earth, because they were form-fitting and made of a material that seemed to shift between solid and liquid, with helmets that were transparent, but somehow also reflective, and the Watcher explained, before Paul could ask, that these are environmental suits because the lunar surface has no breathable atmosphere, and these will provide oxygen and temperature regulation and limited protection from the weapons they will face and Henry Cole ever. The practical sergeant was making mental calculations as he asked 6 men against how many harvesters, and the Watcher said the facility is operated by a minimal crew of approximately 15 to 20 harvesters who are insectoid in nature and roughly twice human size, with natural armor plating and considerable strength. However, they are not warriors, but scientists and technicians, because the facility was never designed to withstand an assault. And Frank Dixon concluded this was because they never expected anyone to actually reach them, since they are used to being the apex predators, and the Watcher confirmed this was correct, because the Ranger advantage lies in surprise and in the human capacity for violence when protecting their own. Since the harvesters understand efficiency and calculation, but they do not understand rage or desperation, or the stubborn refusal to accept defeat that characterizes the human species. And Daniel studied the scout vessel with his mind racing through tactical possibilities as he asked about the facility layout and defenses and where the prisoners are being held. And the Watcher waved a hand so holographic images appeared in the air as 3-dimensional schematics of a structure built into the lunar rock. And Daniel saw corridors and chambers and what looked like holding cells near the center of the complex. And the Watcher explained, the facility has 3 levels, with the Apache warriors being held on the lowest level here, and the main entrance is here, but it will be guarded. Though there is a secondary access point used for waste disposal here that is smaller and may not be monitored as closely. And Henry said, immediately they go in through the back door as a classic infiltration to hit them, where they are not expecting trouble. And Daniel added that once inside, they will need to move fast, so George and Henry and himself will head for the prisoners, while Paul and Frank and Jack will secure their exit route and keep any reinforcements off their backs. And Billy Hayes looked uncertain as he asked, who is going to fly the ship? And the Watcher turned its attention to the young ranger to explain that the vessel's controls have been adapted for human use, but the pilot must remain connected to the ship's navigational systems, and it is not a task that requires years of training, but it does require focus and calm under pressure. And Daniel decided that Billy will pilot because he has steady hands and a cool head, but Billy protested that he should be with them, because he is a ranger, not a pilot. And Daniel said firmly that right now, being a pilot is how Billy serves, because they all have their part to play, and Billy's part is getting them there and getting them home, and the Watcher began instructing Billy on the basic controls of the scout vessel. And Daniel was amazed at how quickly the young man adapted, because the interface responded to touch and thought while anticipating the pilot's needs. And it was like watching someone learn to ride a horse if that horse could think and adjust itself to the rider's skill level. And while Billy trained the other 5, Rangers familiarized themselves with the energy weapons and environmental suits, and Jack Murphy fired a test shot at the Watcher's instruction, and the beam that erupted from the rifle carved a glowing line through a target that materialized in the air, and the smell of ozone filled the chamber, and Jack breathed that they could win the war all over again with just one of these weapons. But the Watcher said the weapons and suits will cease to function once their mission is complete, because they cannot allow such technology to remain in human possession, since the human world is not ready for it. And Frank Dixon pulled on one of the environmental suits, and it seemed to flow around his body like living water, before solidifying into a perfect fit. And through the transparent helmet his expression was grim as he said, not ready for it, because it seems to him they are about to prove they are plenty ready. But the Watcher replied, there is a difference between using a tool and understanding it, because the Rangers will use Watcher technology to save their people, but must not come to depend on it, since the human species must develop its own path to the stars and make its own discoveries and face its own failures, because that is how civilizations grow strong. And Daniel checked the charge on his energy rifle and nodded to his men, because they looked strange in their alien suits while carrying weapons from beyond the stars, but they were still his Rangers, and still the men he trusted to ride into hell if that is what the job required. And Daniel asked how long they have, and the Watcher said the harvesters will begin the final phase of their experiments in 27 hours, so it suggests they depart within the next hour to allow time for approach and planning. And Paul Gardner finished sealing his suit and turned to the Watcher with one more question about why them and why 6 Texas Rangers instead of an army, or the government, or someone with actual authority. And the Watcher's emotions flickered with something that might have been amusement, as it explained that 6 Texas Rangers were in the right place at the right time, and they represent what is best about the human species, with courage and determination, and the refusal to abandon their people, regardless of the odds, and sometimes the right 6 people can accomplish what an army cannot. And Henry Cole added dryly that, and they are already here, so there is no time to fetch anyone else, and the Watcher agreed that too. And Daniel looked at his men to see them standing taller despite their fear, because they were ready to face the impossible since it was the right thing to do. And he thought about those 40 Apache warriors, who were scared and alone on an alien world while waiting for a death they could not understand. And Daniel commanded his Rangers to mount up, because they have got people to save and history to make. The interior of the scout vessel was both alien and oddly familiar, because the walls glowed with soft blue light, and the floor had a slight give to it that reminded Daniel of well-worn leather, and 6 seats were arranged in a circle around a central control column where Billy Hayes sat with his hands hovering over interfaces that responded to his thoughts as much as his touch, and Billy called out for everyone to secure themselves, because the Watcher says the initial acceleration will be intense, and Daniel strapped himself into one of the seats, and the restraints seemed to mold themselves to his body. And through the transparent sections of the hull he could still see the massive chamber where the vessel had been docked. But already that view was changing because the craft was moving, though Daniel felt no sensation of motion, and Billy said, "Here we go." And suddenly the chamber was gone, and the scout vessel burst out of the Watcher's hidden facility and climbed toward the sky at a speed that should have crushed them all. But somehow, impossibly, Daniel felt only a gentle pressure, as if the ship itself was protecting them from the forces that should have torn them apart, and the blue sky of Texas darkened to purple, then to black, and stars appeared brighter and clearer than Daniel had ever seen them from Earth's surface. And there, growing larger by the second, hung the moon, and Jack Murphy whispered "Mother of God" while making the sign of the cross. Again, because they were actually doing this and actually flying to the moon, and George Mitchell's face was pressed against the transparent section of hull with his eyes wide with wonder, as he said his grandfather told him stories about how his grandfather was brought to this country in chains and packed in the hold of a slave ship like cargo. But now here he is as a free man flying to the moon in a ship made by beings from the stars. And if his grandfather could see this, and Henry Cole said quietly that he can, because somewhere and somehow he believes the grandfather can see this. And Paul Gardner was less philosophical and more practical, as he asked Billy how long until they reached the lunar surface. And Billy replied that the ship is saying 3 hours and 42 minutes at current velocity, and they will approach from the dark side and come in low over the surface to avoid detection. And Frank Dixon was checking his energy rifle for the third time while ensuring he understood every aspect of its operation, and he suggested they should go over the plan again to make sure everyone knows their role. And Daniel nodded, because George and Henry and himself are Team 1, and they breached through the waste disposal entrance and moved directly to the holding cells with speed and violence of action to get the prisoners and get out. And he asked for questions, and George asked, what if the Apache do not want to come with them because those warriors do not know the Rangers, and for all they know the Rangers are just more devils from another nightmare. And Daniel said then they explain fast and drag them if they have to. But he is betting once the Apache see them shooting harvesters, they will figure out whose side the Rangers are on. And Frank Dixon said that Team 2, meaning Paul and Jack, will set up a defensive position at the waste entrance, so nothing gets past them to threaten Daniel's team or their escape route. And Jack asked, what if they get overwhelmed? And Frank said with absolute certainty that they will not, because the alternative is leaving 40 men to die and letting monsters know that Earth is easy pickings, and that is not happening. And the hours passed in tense silence, broken only by Billy's occasional updates on their progress, and Daniel watched the Earth shrink behind them as a blue marble suspended in darkness, and he felt the weight of what they were attempting settle on his shoulders. And Paul said eventually that no one back home is going to believe this, because they will think the Rangers lost their minds in the desert. And Henry pointed out the Watcher said the weapons and suits will stop working after the mission, so they will not have any proof this ever happened. But George countered that they will have 40 Apache warriors who suddenly reappeared after vanishing in the desert, and that will be proof enough for those who need it. And Jack asked about those who do not believe, and Daniel said to let them think what they want, because the Rangers will know the truth, and those 40 men will know the truth. And sometimes that has to be enough. And the moon grew larger to fill their view, and Daniel could see craters and mountain ranges and vast plains of ancient rock with no air and no water and no life, but just dead stone that had circled Earth since before humans existed. And somewhere on that desolate surface, 40 men waited in fear, while not knowing if they would live or die. And Billy said with tension in his voice that he is picking up the facility on the ship's sensors, and it is exactly where the Watcher said it would be, while built into the wall of a large crater on the far side of the moon. And Daniel asked if there is any sign they have been detected, and Billy said no, sir, because the ship says its stealth systems are working, and to harvester sensors, they should look like just another piece of space rock. And Daniel said, then let them keep it that way, while telling Billy to take them in low and quiet, and find them a place to land within running distance of that waste entrance. And the scout vessel dropped toward the lunar surface while skimming over terrain that had never felt the touch of wind or water. And Billy's piloting was smooth and confident because it was guided by both his own instincts and the ship's sophisticated systems, and they settled into a shallow crater less than a quarter mile from the harvester facility, and Billy announced touchdown, and said he cannot believe he just said that, and Daniel unstrapped from his seat and moved toward the exit hatch while telling Billy to stay with the ship and keep the engines ready for a fast departure, because the moment Billy sees them coming back, he opens that hatch. And Billy said yes, sir, and asked the captain to bring them home, and Daniel said, that is the plan. Sun and the 5 Rangers gathered at the hatch with energy rifles at the ready and environmental suits sealed, and Daniel took one last look around at his men because they were scared, and he could see it in their eyes. But they were ready, because they were Rangers. And Daniel said to remember, these harvesters think they are the apex predators, and think humans are primitives who cannot fight back. But the Rangers are about to educate them for Texas and for Earth and for those 40 men who are counting on them, even if they do not know it yet. And the others echoed for Earth, and the hatch opened, and the 5 Texas Rangers stepped out onto the surface of the moon, and in the distance, built into the crater wall like a tumor, the harvester facility waited, and somewhere inside 40 Apache warriors waited for a rescue they had no reason to expect. And Daniel Wright activated his rifle and started walking, and behind him his Rangers followed, and above them, Earth hung in the black sky, as a reminder of what they were fighting for, and what they would lose if they failed. Walking on the moon was unlike anything Daniel had ever experienced, because each step carried him forward in long, dreamlike bounds, as if he weighed no more than a child, and the environmental suit adjusted to his movements. But it took several minutes to find a rhythm that did not send him stumbling, and George Mitchell advised to move like walking through deep water, with long, deliberate steps, because they should not fight the low gravity but work with it. And the harvester facility loomed ahead as a dark structure that seemed to grow out of the lunar rock itself, and up close, Daniel could see that it was not built so much as grown with organic-looking curves and protrusions that suggested the harvester's insectoid nature, and faint light glowed from within through what might have been windows. And Henry Cole found the waste disposal entrance exactly where the watcher had indicated, because it was a circular opening roughly 4 feet in diameter and sealed with a hatch that bore no visible locks or handles, and Paul Gardner asked how they open it, and George ran his gloved hands around the edge of the hatch while telling Frank to help him pry it open, and the 2 Rangers wedged their fingers into the gap and pulled, and the hatch resisted for a moment, then swung outward with surprising ease, and beyond it a dark tunnel descended into the facility, and Jack Murphy peered into the darkness while saying, "At least it is big enough for them to fit through," because he was half expecting they would have to crawl through alien sewage, and Henry pointed out the watcher said this was for waste disposal, not waste transport, so it probably just ejects sealed containers into space. But Jack muttered it still. Smells wrong, though. That was impossible through the environmental suits, and Daniel took point while lowering himself into the tunnel, and interior lights flickered on as he descended because they were responding to his presence, and the walls were smooth and slightly warm to the touch and made of the same organic-looking material as the exterior. And when they reached the bottom of the tunnel, Daniel ordered Team 2 to set up here, because this is their exit route, and nothing gets through this choke point. And Frank Dixon and Paul Gardner and Jack Murphy took positions where the waste tunnel joined a larger corridor, because they had clear lines of fire in 3 directions, and could hold off a significant force if necessary. And Frank said they will give Daniel 30 minutes, and if the captain is not back by then, they are coming in after him. But Daniel replied to give them 40, and if they are not back by then, to seal the tunnel and get Billy off this rock, because someone has to tell Earth what is out here. And Frank said firmly, that is not happening because they all go home or none of them do. And Daniel wanted to argue but did not have time, so he said 30 minutes then, and told George and Henry to come with him, and the 3 Rangers moved deeper into the facility, while following the route the watcher had shown them. And the corridors were wide and tall, because they were built for creatures larger than humans, and the lighting was strange, as a reddish glow that made everything look like it was covered in blood. And they encountered the first harvester at a junction of 3 corridors, and it was even more horrifying in person than the watcher's images had suggested, because it was 8 feet tall and covered in chitinous plates that gleamed like black metal, with too many joints in its limbs and a head that was all compound eyes and mandibles, and it carried what looked like a tablet, while absorbed in whatever data it displayed. And Daniel did not hesitate because he raised his energy rifle and fired, and the beam caught the harvester in the center of its thorax, while burning through its armor like paper. And the creature made a sound like ripping metal, and collapsed with its legs twitching. And Henry muttered so much for stealth, but Daniel replied they never had stealth because they had surprise and now they have momentum, so they need to move fast, and they ran through the corridors, and Daniel was grateful for the low gravity that let them cover ground quickly despite the bulky suits. And twice more they encountered harvesters, and twice more the energy rifles proved devastatingly effective, because the creatures were tough, but they were not warriors, and they panicked and tried to flee rather than fight. And George observed after they dropped a third harvester that these beings have never been prey before, so they do not know how to respond to being hunted. And an alarm began to wail as a pulsing sound that made Daniel's teeth ache, and he said, "Well, they know now, so the Rangers should double time it," and they burst into a large chamber and found what they were looking for, because 40 Apache warriors were contained in transparent cylinders, arranged in rows, and the warriors were unconscious and suspended in some kind of fluid with alien machinery attached to their bodies, and monitoring equipment that Daniel could not begin to understand surrounded each cylinder. And Henry asked how they get them out while moving toward the nearest cylinder, and Daniel studied the cylinders while looking for any kind of release mechanism, and his hand passed over a panel beside one of the containers, and it lit up with symbols he could not read, but there was an image showing the cylinder opening from the top, and Daniel said here while pressing what looked like a control, and the cylinder's top section retracted, and the fluid began to drain, and the Apache warrior inside started to wake while coughing and gasping. And Daniel commanded to get them all open and told someone to find something these men can use for weapons because they will want to fight. And George found a storage area with what looked like tools that were not weapons exactly, but heavy implements that could serve the purpose, and he began distributing them to the Apache warriors as they woke. And the first warrior to fully recover was a man of about 40 with scars that spoke of many battles, and he looked at the 3 Rangers in their alien suits and at the energy rifles they carried, and at the dead harvester visible through the chamber entrance, and his eyes widened with understanding, and he said in accented English that the Rangers came for them even though they are enemies, and Daniel replied, "Not today, because today they are all just men who want to go home," and he asked if the warrior can help get his people moving because they do not have much time. And the warrior nodded and began speaking rapidly in Apache while rousing his companions, and they moved with impressive speed, despite their confusion and recent trauma. And within minutes all 40 were free and armed with whatever implements they could find. And Daniel said this way while leading them toward the exit, and told them to stay together and stay quiet if they can, but do not hesitate to fight if they are cornered. And they made it back to the junction where they had left Team 2 before the harvesters finally organized a response, because a group of at least 10 creatures came around a corner, and these ones were carrying weapons that crackled with energy, and Frank Dixon shouted contact, and Team 2 opened fire, and the corridor became a storm of directed energy, and whatever exotic weapons the harvesters were using, and the air filled with the smell of burning metal and ozone, and one of the Apache warriors went down with a smoking hole in his shoulder, but his companions dragged him to cover and kept fighting. Daniel commanded everyone to move while directing the rescued prisoners toward the waste tunnel, and the harvesters tried to cut them off, but the Apache warriors fought with a fury born of days of torment because they might not understand the alien technology around them, but they understood combat and understood violence, and they showed no mercy. And Paul Gardner took a hit that burned through the shoulder of his environmental suit, and the breach alarms screamed, but the suit's automatic system sealed the damage before he lost too much air, and he kept fighting with one hand while picking his shots with grim determination, and Henry Cole stood at the tunnel entrance while commanding everyone up and directing traffic because Rangers go last, and the Apache warriors climbed with impressive speed while understanding that height meant safety. And they pulled their wounded up with them while leaving no one behind, and Daniel counted heads as they passed and got 37, then 38, then 39, then 40. So all were accounted for, and he shouted for Team 2 that it is time to go, and Jack Murphy laid down covering fire while Frank and Paul retreated up the tunnel, and harvesters poured into the corridor, with more than Daniel had seen so far, and their mandibles were clicking in rage or fear. And Daniel shouted for Jack to move, and the Irish Ranger fired one last burst and turned to climb, but a harvester weapon caught him in the back, and he cried out while falling, and Daniel grabbed him and hauled him bodily up the tunnel, with his energy rifle firing one-handed to keep the creatures back, and they emerged onto the lunar surface to find Billy Hayes had brought the scout vessel right to the tunnel entrance with its hatch open and waiting, and the Apache warriors were already streaming inside, and George Mitchell stood at the hatch while directing them with hand signals, and Daniel commanded everyone in while telling Billy to be ready to lift off the second that hatch closes, and Henry was the last up the tunnel after Daniel, and they sealed the hatch behind them. And through the transparent sections of the hull, Daniel could see harvesters pouring out of the facility with At least 20 of them and their weapons raised, and Daniel shouted for Billy to go now. And the scout vessel lifted off with incredible acceleration, just as the harvesters opened fire and energy bolts struck the hull but were absorbed by shields that the Rangers had not known the ship possessed, and in seconds they were climbing away from the lunar surface, while leaving the facility and its remaining inhabitants behind. And Daniel looked around the interior of the vessel because it was crowded with 46 men instead of the 6 it had carried before. But everyone was accounted for, and Jack Murphy was wounded but alive, while being tended by one of the Apache warriors who apparently had medical knowledge, and Paul's suit was patched and he was breathing normally, and they had done it because against all odds, 6 Texas Rangers had assaulted an alien facility on the moon and rescued 40 men. And through the hull, Earth was growing larger as a beautiful blue jewel waiting to welcome them home. And the journey back took less time than the journey out because Billy had grown confident with the controls, and the scout vessel responded to his commands like a well-trained horse, and the Apache warriors sat in quiet groups, while speaking softly among themselves and occasionally looking at the Rangers with expressions that mixed gratitude with disbelief. And the warrior who had spoken English earlier approached Daniel and asked what happens now because they return to Earth. But how do they explain where they have been and what they have seen? And Daniel admitted he did not know yet, but suggested they tell the truth, because the truth is all they have, even if no one believes them. And the warrior whose name Daniel learned was Running Deer said his people will believe him, because they have always known there are powers in the world beyond human understanding and spirits that walk between the stars. And Daniel realized that maybe the Apache had been more prepared for this revelation than the Rangers were, because their culture had never pretended humans were alone or supreme in creation. And Henry Cole was tending to Jack Murphy's wounds with supplies from a medical kit that had materialized from the ship's walls when George touched a certain panel, and Jack was pale but stable because the harvester weapon had burned through muscle, but missed anything vital. And he joked weakly that he had always wanted to be the first Irishman on the moon, though he had hoped to enjoy it more. And Frank Dixon was watching Earth grow larger with an expression of deep thought, and he said quietly that everything has changed because they can never look at the sky the same way again. And they know now that humans are not alone and not safe. And there are things out there that see them as nothing more than cattle, and Paul Gardner overheard and added that they also know there are things out there that protect humans and guide them and believe they are worth saving. And that has to count for something. And the Watcher had said humans would walk on the moon in less than 100 years, and now 6 Rangers and 40 Apache warriors had already done it in 1876, and Daniel wondered if that would change the timeline, and if humans would reach for the stars sooner because of what happened today. And Billy called out that they are approaching the entry point, and the ship will take them back to the chamber, where they started. And Daniel told everyone to hold on and brace for the transition, and the scout vessel dove toward Earth and the sky grew brighter, and suddenly they were no longer in space, but in the massive chamber inside the Watcher facility. And the ship settled gently to the floor and the hatch opened, and the Watcher was waiting along with several others of its kind. And they looked at the 46 humans emerging from the scout vessel with what might have been approval or pride, and the Watcher communicated directly to all their minds, saying they have done well, because humanity has proven itself capable of protecting its own and worthy of knowing the truth. And from this day forward, the Watchers will begin preparing humans for their future among the stars. But it will be a slow preparation because humans must earn each step and learn each lesson and not be given more than they can handle. And Running Deer asked through Daniel if the Watchers will protect them from the harvesters, and the Watcher replied that they will continue to shield Earth from notice as they have for thousands of years. But humans must understand the threat is real, and someday humans will need to stand on their own because the Watchers will not be there forever. And Daniel asked what happens to the weapons and suits and the knowledge they have gained, and the Watcher said the technology will cease to function within the hour and will become inert metal and fabric. But the knowledge and the experience and the proof that humans can face the impossible and win will remain, and that is the greatest gift the Watchers can give, because it is not the tools that make a species strong, but the courage to use them and the wisdom to know when. And the Watcher gestured, and a doorway opened in the wall showing the Texas desert beyond, bathed in afternoon sunlight. and it told them to go home and tell their story to those who will listen and plant the seeds of knowledge that will grow over generations, because in 100 years, humans will reach the moon with their own ships, and in 200 years they will walk among the stars, and in 500 years they will take their place as protectors of other young species, and the cycle will continue. And Daniel led his rangers and the 40 Apache warriors through the doorway and back into the Texas heat, and behind them, the doorway closed and vanished as if it had never been. And they stood in the same canyon where they had found the artifact 3 days ago, but the artifact was gone, and their regular weapons and clothing had been returned, and it was as if the journey had never happened, except for the memories and the 40 Apache warriors standing among them and Jack Murphy's wound, which was now bandaged with regular cloth instead of alien technology, and Running Deer looked at Daniel and said, "His people will return to their lands, and they will remember this day, and they will tell the story of how Texas Rangers came from the sky to save them, and how all humans are brothers when facing the darkness beyond the stars." And Daniel nodded and shook the warrior's hand, and watched as the 40 Apache warriors gathered their weapons and supplies, and began the long walk back to their territory. And Henry Cole asked what they tell the captain of Rangers and the territorial governor and everyone who asks where they have been. And Daniel said they tell the truth because the truth is all they have. The 6 Rangers rode back toward the nearest settlement with the sun setting behind them and painting the desert in shades of red and gold, and none of them spoke much because they were each lost in their own thoughts about what they had experienced and what it meant for the future. And Billy Hayes finally broke the silence by saying he keeps expecting to wake up and find it was all a fever dream brought on by too much time in the desert heat. But the memory is too clear and too detailed to be anything but real. And George Mitchell agreed, while adding that his grandfather used to say, "The most important truths are the ones that sound like lies, because those are the truths that change the world." And Jack Murphy shifted in his saddle, while wincing at the pain in his back, and said he has got the wound to prove it was real, even if the weapon that caused it has stopped existing. And Paul Gardner wondered aloud how they write this in their report, because the Rangers are supposed to document everything they do on patrol, and Daniel said they write exactly what happened and let others decide what to believe, because their job is to tell the truth, not to make it palatable. And Frank Dixon pointed out that the Apache warriors will corroborate their story, since 40 men do not just disappear and reappear without explanation. And Henry Cole added that the real question is not whether people believe them, but what those who do believe will do with the knowledge. Because knowing humans are not alone in the universe changes everything from religion to politics to how people see their place in creation. And they reached the settlement of Dry Springs 2 days later, and the entire town turned out to see them because word had spread that the Rangers were tracking a large Apache war party, and people had been worried about raids, and the territorial marshal named Lawrence Carter met them at the edge of town and asked what happened to the Apache, and where are the bodies if there was a fight. And Daniel dismounted and told the marshal there was no fight because the Apache were not raiders, but victims, and they had been taken by forces the marshal would not believe, and returned by Rangers who had no choice but to do the impossible. And the marshal looked confused and asked Daniel to explain that again more slowly, and Daniel took a deep breath and told the whole story, from finding the artifact to meeting the Watchers to the journey to the moon and the rescue of 40 Apache warriors. And the marshal listened with an expression that shifted from confusion to disbelief to concern. And when Daniel finished, the marshal asked if the Rangers had been drinking, and Daniel said no, sir, and invited the marshal to examine them for any sign of intoxication, and the marshal did so and found them all clear-headed and sober. And he asked if they had eaten anything strange or been exposed to gases in the desert. And again, Daniel said no, and pointed out that all 6 Rangers tell the same story with the same details, and that 40 Apache warriors are alive and free when they should have been dead or captured. And the marshal scratched his head and said he does not know what to make of this, because it sounds like pure fiction, but he has known Daniel Wright for 10 years and never known him to lie or exaggerate. And Frank Dixon suggested they wire the territorial governor and let him decide what to do with the information, because this is beyond the authority of local law enforcement, and the marshal agreed and sent a telegram. That evening marked urgent, And 3 days later, a reply came back, summoning the Rangers to the territorial capital for a formal debriefing, and the governor wanted to hear their story personally. And so the 6 Rangers made the journey to Austin and were ushered into the governor's office, where Governor Richard Ellis sat behind a large desk with several military officers and territorial officials flanking him, and the governor asked Daniel to repeat his report, and Daniel did so, while the officials listened in silence and took notes. And when he finished, the governor asked if he understood how insane this story sounds, and Daniel said yes. Sir, he does, but insane does not mean untrue. And one of the military officers named Colonel Peter Hayes asked if they have any proof, and Daniel admitted they do not, because the alien technology stopped working as promised, and the only evidence is the testimony of 46 men and the wounds they carry and the knowledge they cannot unknow. And another official asked why the Watchers would reveal themselves to 6 Rangers instead of to the government or military or someone with real authority. And Henry Cole spoke up to say maybe that was exactly the point, because the Watchers did not want to deal with politics or bureaucracy, and they wanted people who would act without hesitation and who understood that some things are more important than following proper channels. And the governor leaned back in his chair and studied the 6 Rangers for a long moment, and then said he believes them because he has read their service records and knows they are good men who have never shown signs of dishonesty or mental instability. And more importantly, the Apache story corroborates theirs, because several Apache warriors have been seen by scouts, and they tell the same tale of being taken by demons and rescued by men in strange armor who came from the sky. And Colonel Hayes asked what the governor plans to do with this information. And Governor Ellis said he will document it and seal it and pass it up the chain to Washington and let the federal government decide, because this is beyond the scope of territorial authority. And he will also ensure the Rangers are not punished or dismissed for doing their duty, even if that duty took them places no one thought possible. And he thanked them for their service and told them they are dismissed. And as the Rangers were leaving, the governor called after them to ask one more question about whether they think the Watchers will contact humans again. And Daniel turned and said he thinks the Watchers are always watching and will reach out when the time is right and when humans are ready for the next step. But he also thinks humans need to prepare themselves, because the universe is bigger and more dangerous than anyone imagined. And Governor Ellis nodded slowly and said he will make sure the right people hear that message, even if it takes years for anyone to listen. And the Rangers left Austin and returned to their regular duties of patrolling the frontier and dealing with outlaws and protecting settlers. And life went on as it always had. But something had changed in each of them, because they could not look at the stars without remembering what lay beyond them. And they could not hear stories of strange lights in the desert without wondering if the Watchers were still there and still preparing humanity for its future. 20 years passed, and the 6 Rangers went their separate ways as age and circumstance took them from active duty. And Daniel Wright retired from the Rangers in 1896 and became a teacher in a small school near San Antonio, where he taught history and geography. And sometimes when his students asked about the stars, he would smile and tell them that humans would walk on the moon someday, and the students would laugh because everyone knew that was impossible. But Daniel knew better, and he kept a journal of everything that happened that day in 1876, and he wrote down every detail he could remember, because he knew that someday someone would need to know the truth. And Henry Cole stayed with the Rangers until 1900 and became captain of his own company. And he trained young Rangers to be observant and brave and to never assume they knew everything about the world, because the world was full of mysteries, and on clear nights, he would stand outside and look at the moon and remember walking on its surface and wonder if the harvesters were still up there, and if the Watchers were still protecting Earth. And George Mitchell used his fame from the Apache rescue to become a voice for civil rights and equality, because he argued that if a freed slave could fly to the moon and fight aliens, then surely all men deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of the color of their skin. And his speeches drew crowds, though many dismissed his moon story as metaphor or madness, but those who knew him believed every word. And Paul Gardner went back east and became a writer, and he published adventure novels that were thinly veiled accounts of his experiences, and critics praised his imagination while readers loved his vivid descriptions of alien worlds and space travel. And Paul never told them it was all true, because he knew they would not believe him. But he planted seeds of wonder in young minds, and Some of those young minds would grow up to be scientists and engineers who would make space travel real. And Frank Dixon returned to his family's ranch and raised cattle and children. And he told his grandchildren stories about the time he fought monsters on the moon, and they thought he was just being a colorful old man. But he made them promise to always look up at the stars and remember that humans are part of something bigger than themselves. And Jack Murphy eventually died from complications related to his wound in 1904, and at his funeral the other 5 Rangers gathered and they toasted him with whiskey and remembered how he had laid down covering fire so they could all escape, and they agreed he was the bravest man they ever knew. And Billy Hayes became a pilot when airplanes were invented, and he was one of the first men in Texas to earn a pilot's license, because he said once you have flown to the moon in an alien spacecraft, everything else seems easy, and he taught flying to young men during the Great War and told them they were the future of human exploration, even if they did not know it yet. And in 1969, when Apollo 11 landed on the moon, Daniel Wright was long dead. But his journal had been passed to his grandson, who was a professor of history, and the grandson watched the moon landing on television and understood for the first time that his grandfather had not been crazy or lying, but had been telling the literal truth. And he went to the attic and found the journal and read it cover to cover and wept, because he realized his grandfather had walked on the moon 93 years before Neil Armstrong, and no one had believed him. And the grandson tried to publish the journal, but no one would touch it because it sounded too much like science fiction, and the dates were all wrong and there was no proof, but he kept it safe and passed it to his own children with instructions to never forget that sometimes the impossible is just the not yet accomplished. And in 2015, a researcher studying declassified government documents found a sealed file from 1876, marked eyes only, and inside was Governor Richard Ellis's report about 6 Texas Rangers who claimed to have traveled to the moon and rescued 40 Apache warriors from alien captors. And the report had been dismissed as the ravings of men driven mad by the desert, but it had been filed away rather than destroyed, because someone thought it might be important someday. And the researcher published a paper about it, and it became a minor curiosity in historical circles, and skeptics said it proved that conspiracy theories have always existed, while believers said it proved that humans have been visited by aliens for centuries, and the truth has always lay somewhere in between and on the moon. In the far side crater where the harvester facility had been, there was nothing but dust and rock because the watchers had removed all traces of the installation after the Rangers rescued the prisoners. But if anyone had looked closely, they might have found 6 sets of boot prints in the lunar soil preserved forever in the airless environment. And those boot prints were made in 1876 by 6 Texas Rangers who proved that courage and determination can overcome any obstacle, even the laws of physics and the vast gulf of space. And the story became legend, and the legend became myth. But somewhere in the darkness between the stars, the watchers continued their vigil, and they watched as humanity built rockets and satellites and space stations, and they watched as humans took their first steps toward becoming a spacefaring civilization. And they were pleased because the 6 Rangers had proven what the Watchers had always believed, which is that humanity was worth protecting and worth guiding, because when the time came, and when the stakes were highest, humans would always choose to stand and fight rather than run and hide. And that quality, more than any technology or knowledge, was what would allow humans to survive in a universe full of dangers. And that quality was what would eventually make humans into the protectors they were meant to be, and the Watchers knew that someday, perhaps in another 500 years, humanity would be ready to learn the full truth about the galaxy and about the ancient war between those who nurture young civilizations and those who harvest them. And when that day came, humanity would have to choose which side they were on, but the Watchers were confident that humans would choose correctly, because 6 Texas Rangers in 1876 had already shown them the human heart. And it was brave and stubborn and unwilling to abandon those who needed help, even when those in need were enemies and even when the cost was high. And that was the real revelation that the Rangers had provided. Not that aliens exist or that space travel is possible, but that humans, when pushed to their limit, will always choose compassion over convenience and courage over comfort, and that choice more than anything else would determine humanity's future among the stars. And so, the story ends where it began, in the Texas desert under endless sky, where 6 men found an artifact that changed their lives, and through them began to change the world. And if you stand in that canyon today on a quiet night, you might feel something in the air, a presence or a watching, and you might look up at the stars and wonder if somewhere out there the watchers are still keeping vigil, and if somewhere out there other young rangers are being tested and proven and prepared for the challenges that await humanity in the vast darkness between the worlds.